This creepypasta is called Laughing Jack. It was on a summer day. My 5-year-old son James was playing outside in the backyard of our suburban home. James has always been a quiet boy. He plays by himself mostly, and he never had many friends. But he has always had a wild imagination. I was in the kitchen feeding our dog Fido when I heard what sounded like James talking to someone in the backyard. I'm not sure who it was he could be talking to. Could he have finally met a friend? Being a single dad, it's hard for me to always keep eye on my son, so I decided to go outside and check on him. When I went into the backyard, I was a bit confused, because James was the only person back there. Was he talking to himself? I could have sworn I heard another voice. James, it's time to come inside, I called out to him. He had come inside and sat down at the kitchen table. It was about lunchtime, so I decided to make him a turkey sandwich. James, who were you talking to out there? I asked. James looked up for a moment. I was playing with my new friend, he said, smiling. I poured him some milk and continued to pry, as any good father would. Does your friend have a name? Why didn't you ask him to have lunch with us? I asked. James stared at me for a moment before replying. His name is Laughing Jack. I was a bit taken back by what he said. Oh, that's a strange name. What does your friend look like? I asked, a bit confused. He's a clown. He has long hair, a big swirly cone nose. He has long arms and baggy pants or stripy socks. He always smiles. I realized my son was talking about an imaginary friend. I suppose it was normal for kids his age to have an imaginary friend, especially when he has no real kids to play with. It's probably just a phase. The rest of the day went as per usual. As it was starting to get late, so I put James on the bed. I tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and made sure to turn on his night light before I closed the door. I was pretty tired myself, so I decided to go to bed not long after. I had an awful nightmare. It was dark. I was in some kind of rundown amusement park. I was scared, running towards the endless fields of empty tents, broken down rides, and abandoned game huts. The whole place had a horrible look to it. Everything was black and white. The prized stuffed animals all hung from nooses in the game huts, all with sick grins stitched to their faces. It felt like the whole park was looking at me, even though there wasn't another living thing in sight. Then suddenly, I began to hear music play. The sound of pop goes wheel began being played on a squeeze box, echoed through the park. It was hypnotizing. I felt its tune to the circus sense, almost in a trance, unable to stop my legs from moving forward. It was pitch black. The only light came from a single spotlight shining on the center at the big top. As I walked towards the light, the music slowed down. I found myself singing along, unable to stop. All around the mother bush, the monkey chased the weasel, the monkey saw all this fun. The music stopped, right before its climax, and suddenly the light shot on. The intensity of the light was practically blinding. All I could see was a small, dark silhouette shuffle towards me. Then another one appeared, and another, and then another. There were dozens of them, all coming towards me. As they grew closer, I could see they were children. As I looked at each one of them, I noticed they were all horribly disfigured and mutilated. Some had cuts all over their body, others were severely burnt, and others were even missing limbs, eyes. The children enveloped me, clawing at my flesh, dragging me to the ground, and tearing inside me. As the children tore me apart, and I faded away, all I could hear was laughter. Horrible, awful, evil laughter. I woke up the next morning in a cold sweat. As I took a few deep breaths, I looked over to see a few of James' action figures. being positioned and facing me at the top of my nightstand. I sighed. James had probably woken up early and put these here. I gathered up his toys and made my way to James's room. However, when I opened the door, James was sound asleep. I just shrugged and placed the toys back in his toy box and headed out to the living room. A little while earlier, James woke up, and I made him breakfast. He was quiet and seemed a bit groggy. Perhaps he didn't sleep well either. I decided to ask him about the toys. James, honey, did you put the toys in Daddy's room this morning? Dad shot up at me for a moment and then quickly glanced down back at his cereal. Laughing Jack did it. I rolled my eyes and responded, "Will you tell Laughing Jack to keep the toys in your room?" James nodded and finished with his breakfast, and then decided to go play in the backyard. I went to relax in the living room, and I must have dozed off because I woke up a couple hours later. Shit, I need to go check on James. I was a bit worried. It's been over 2 hours and I hadn't checked on him. I went and stepped out onto the backyard, but James wasn't there anymore. I was getting nervous, so I called to him, James, where are you? And then I heard a giggle coming from the front yard. I rushed towards the gate around to the front of the house. James was sitting on the sidewalk. I breathed a sigh of relief and walked over to him. James, how many times have I told you to stay in the back? James, what are you eating? James looked up at me and reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of hard candies in all colors. This made me very nervous. James, who gave you that candy? James just stared at me, not speaking. James, tell Dad, where did you get that candy? James hung his head down and said, Laughing Jack gave it to me. My heart sunk. I kneeled down to look in his eye. James, I've had enough of this damn Laughing Jack. He's not real. Now this is a very serious situation, and I need to know who gave you that candy. I could see my son's eyes tear up. But Dad, Laughing Jack did give me that candy. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. James had never lied to me, but what he's telling me is impossible. I'm gonna spit out the candy and throw the rest away. James appeared to be fine, so maybe I was just overreacting after all. He could have got it from Tom and Linda from next door, or Mr. Walker down the street. Either way, I was going to have to keep a closer eye on James. That night, I put James to bed as usual, and decided to go to bed early myself. Suddenly, I woke up by a loud banging sound coming from the kitchen. I sprung out of bed and hurried down the stairs. When I got to the kitchen, I was horrified. Everything on the counters had been thrown to the floor, and our dog Fido hung dead from the light fixture. His stomach was cut open and stuffed with candy, the same type that James was eating earlier that day. My shock was quickly broken by a sharp screaming coming from James' room, followed by loud crashes. I quickly grabbed the knife from the drawer and moved up the stairs with the speed that only a dad whose child was in danger could have. I burst through the door and flickered on the lights. Everything in the room was knocked over and tossed on the floor. My poor son in his bed crying and shaking with fear, a pool of urine staining the sheets. I scooped up my child and ran out the house and went to the next door Tom and Lydia's house. Luckily, they were still awake. Let me use the phone and they called the police. It didn't take them long to arrive, and I explained what happened. They looked at me as if I were crazy. They searched the house, but all they found was a dead dog and 2 trashed rooms. The officer told me that someone had probably gotten in the house and done this right before making a quick escape when they heard me coming up the stairs. But I knew it wasn't true. All the doors were locked and none of my windows were open. Whoever it was in my house, it did not come from the outside. The next day, James stayed inside. I didn't want him out of my sight. I went into the garage and found his old baby monitor and set it up in his room. If anything comes to his room tonight, I would be able to hear it. I went into the kitchen and grabbed the largest kitchen knife from the drawer and put it in my nightstand. Imaginary friend or not, I'm not letting anything hurt my little boy. Soon enough, night came. I put James to bed. He was afraid, but I promised him that I wasn't going to let anything happen to him. Tucked him in, gave him a kiss, and turned on the nightlight before closing the door and whispered to him, "Good night, James. I love you." I tried to stay up as long as I could, but after a few hours I felt myself drifting off. My baby would be safe for the night, and I needed sleep. Just as I lay on my head, on the pillow, I heard a soft noise coming from Baby Mark. I had put on my nightstand. At first it sounded like interference, like kind of a radio wave. Then it turned to a soft moan. James was sleeping, and I heard it. The laugh from my nightmare, that horrible laugh. I sprung up from bed, grabbed a knife from under my pillow. I rushed over to James' room and creaked the door open. I tried the light switch, but it wouldn't come on. I took a step, and I could feel the warm, thick liquid on my feet. Suddenly, James' nightlight came on, and I could see the absolute horror laid out in front of me. James' body was nailed up on the wall. Nails piercing through his hands and feet. His chest was cut wide open, and his organs hung down on the floor. His eyes and tongue had been removed along with most of his teeth. I was disgusted. I could hardly believe this was my baby boy. And I heard it again, a soft, desperate moan. James was still alive. My poor baby, in so much pain, barely clinging to life. I ran across the room and vomited on the floor. But my sickness was interrupted by a horrible cackle coming from behind me. I spun around while still wiping the bile from my mouth. Then out of the shadows emerged the fiend responsible for all this all. The laughing giant. His ghost, white skin, and matted black hair hung down to his shoulders. He had piercing white eyes surrounded by black, dark rings. His twisted smile revealed a row of sharp, jagged teeth. His skin didn't look like skin at all. It almost looked like rubber or plastic. He wore a patchy black and white clown outfit with striped sleeves and socks. His body itself was grotesque. His long arms hanging down from his waist, and the way he was posed made him look almost boneless with a laugh. He let out a sickening laugh, as if to let me know he was pleased with my reaction to his work. He then turned around slowly in front of James and began to laugh even more at the horrific sight he had laid out. That was enough to shake me from my terror. I snapped, "Get away from me, you bastard!" I rushed at the monster, raising the knife above my head, and stabbed down at him. As soon as the knife touched, it disappeared in a cloud of black smoke. The knife passed right through it, pierced James, still being held, splashing warm blood on my face. What have I done? My baby. Killed my baby! I immediately fell to my knees, and I could hear sirens from the distance going loud. Baby, sweet baby boy. Promise Daddy will protect you. Sorry, James. So sorry. Policemen arrived to find me in front of my son, still wielding the knife covered in my baby's blood. Trial was short. Insanity. I was placed in Pyropolis' house of the criminally insane, where I have been for the past 2 months. It's not bad here. The only reason why I'm awake now is because someone is playing Pop Goes the Weasel outside of my window. I will talk to the orderlies about it in a minute.